Sometimes the most abandoned souls find each other when the world has given up on them both. In the harsh Idaho territory of 1882, a drought-stricken mountain village made a decision that would haunt them forever. They threw an aging pack donkey into the raging river to drown, declaring the faithful animal nothing but a burden. Jack Rourke had seen enough cruelty in his years drifting the frontier trails, but something about watching that terrified donkey struggle against the current broke through his hardened heart. Without a word, the grizzled cowboy waded into the deadly waters and pulled the animal to safety. The townsfolk called the donkey cursed, claiming it had outlived 3 owners and brought nothing but misfortune. But Jack didn't believe in curses, only in second chances. As he and his unlikely companion headed into the high country, they would discover that sometimes the very thing a community throws away holds the key to their salvation. What they found hidden in those mountains would change everything, but would the village accept help from the outcasts they had condemned? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and desperation as Jack Rourke crouched by the river's edge, his weathered hands still trembling from the cold water. The donkey stood beside him, coat matted and dark with river silt, flanks heaving from the near drowning that should have been its end. 3 smooth stones rested in Jack's palm river stones, worn gentle by decades of current, picked up without thinking as he dragged the animal to safety. Now they felt heavy as bullets, each one a weight of choice he hadn't expected to carry. Behind them, the village of Copper Falls hugged the mountainside like a collection of desperate prayers carved from timber and hope. The drought had been merciless this year, turning streams to trickles and cattle to walking skeletons. But it was the sight of grown men dragging a faithful animal to the water's edge that had stopped Jack's heart cold. He'd been riding through, same as always, when the commotion near the bridge caught his attention. "Cursed beast," Mayor Henriksen had declared, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. 3 owners dead in 5 years. Ain't natural for an animal to outlive so many good men. The crowd had murmured agreement, their faces hard with the kind of judgment that comes easy when survival feels uncertain. Sarah Mitchell, the blacksmith's widow, clutched her shawl tight against the morning chill. "My Thomas always said that donkey brought nothing but trouble. Look what happened to old Pete when he took it on." Jack remembered Pete Garrison found frozen in a snowdrift last winter, his body curled around a bottle of whiskey that hadn't been enough to keep the cold at bay. But that was the mountain's doing, not some curse from a gentle pack animal who'd worked harder than most men Jack had known. The donkey had fought the rope with surprising strength, its dark eyes wide with an intelligence that spoke of understanding not just fear, but betrayal. These people had been its world. It had carried their supplies up impossible trails, hauled timber for their homes, worked through storms that would have broken lesser animals. Now they repaid that loyalty with swift current and certain death. Jack had never been one for grand gestures. 37 years of drifting from camp to camp, job to job, had taught him to mind his own business and keep moving. His leather journal, tucked safe in his saddlebags, contained nothing but trail maps and practical notes which passes stayed clear longest, where to find water in drought years, which towns paid fair wages for temporary work. No names, no attachments, no reasons to stay anywhere longer than it took to earn traveling money. But something about that moment by the river had changed everything. "You don't know what you're doing, stranger." Mayor Henriksen had warned as Jack waded into the current. "That animal's got the devil's own luck, brings death to anyone who gets too close." Jack hadn't answered. Words were cheap, and actions spoke clearer in the territory. He'd simply grabbed the rope around the donkey's neck and pulled, fighting current and superstition with equal determination. The animal's struggle ceased the moment Jack's hands touched the halter, as if it recognized kindness, even in its terror. Now, an hour later, they stood together by the roadside like two refugees from different wars. Jack studied the animal more carefully in daylight. It was older. Certainly grey muzzle and careful movements spoke of years well lived. But the eyes held clarity, and the way it positioned itself suggested alertness rather than the dull acceptance of a creature ready for death. "Well, old friend," Jack murmured, slipping the river stones into his pocket. "Seems we're both without welcome here." The donkey's ears twitched forward, not in fear, but attention. Jack had worked with enough animals to recognize the difference. This one was listening, considering, making judgments of its own about this gruff stranger who'd pulled it from the water. The village behind them buzzed with disapproval and worry. Jack could hear fragments of conversation drifting on the wind, concerns about angering whatever dark forces supposedly surrounded the animal, warnings about strangers who interfered with community decisions. Mayor Henriksen's voice rose above the rest, declaring that Jack and his cursed companion were no longer welcome in Copper Falls. Fine by Jack. He'd never planned to stay anyway. But as he gathered his horse's reins and prepared to move on, something made him pause. The donkey had followed him without coercion, positioning itself beside his mare with the natural ease of a creature accustomed to travel. More interesting, his horse, usually particular about her companions, showed no anxiety around the newcomer. If anything, she seemed calmer, as if recognizing a fellow traveler who understood the rhythm of the road. Jack opened his journal and sketched a quick note about Copper Falls, not because he planned to return, but because accurate records had kept him alive through 3 decades of frontier life. "Good water source," he wrote, "but poor judgment. Avoid during drought years." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley. Jack knew these mountains well enough to understand that winter would come early this year, and with it, challenges that would test even the strongest communities. Copper Falls was already struggling. He'd seen it in the hollow cheeks of the children, the careful way women portioned out grain, the desperate edge to the men's voices when they spoke of the donkey's supposed curse. They blamed the animal because blaming the weather, or poor planning, or simple bad luck felt too large and hopeless. Better to focus their fear on something they could control, something they could eliminate. The donkey had simply been convenient. As they walked away from the village, Jack found himself studying his unexpected companion more closely. The animal moved with purpose despite its recent trauma, pausing occasionally to test the wind or examine interesting scents along the trail. Intelligence, certainly, but something more, a kind of awareness that suggested this creature had seen more of the world than most. "Got a name, I suppose," Jack said conversationally. The donkey's ears swiveled toward him. "Though I reckon whatever they called you back there won't suit our purposes now." The mountains ahead rose in familiar blue-green waves, promising solitude and the kind of peace that came from being far from the judgment of desperate people. Jack had planned to winter in the high country anyway. He had supplies enough for 2, and the extra company might prove useful when the snows came. He pulled out his journal again and made another note. "Acquired traveling companion. Appears healthy despite village claims. Will assess usefulness over coming weeks." But even as he wrote the practical words, Jack found himself thinking about those smooth river stones in his pocket, and the way the donkey had stopped struggling the moment it felt human kindness instead of condemnation. Some bonds, he was beginning to realize, couldn't be measured in practical terms. The road ahead wound into territory he knew well, high passes and hidden valleys, where a man and his animals could disappear for months without seeing another soul. It was exactly the kind of life Jack had chosen for himself years ago, when staying in one place had become too painful to contemplate. Now, with this unexpected companion beside him, he wondered if solitude might finally lose some of its appeal. 3 miles up the mountain trail, Jack stopped to fashion a proper halter from the spare rope in his saddlebags. The makeshift noose the villagers had used lay discarded by the roadside. He'd cut it away the moment they were out of sight, unable to bear the sight of that rough hemp around the animal's neck. Now he worked the softer braided rope with careful hands, creating something that would guide rather than bind. "Need to call you something," he said as he adjusted the fit. The donkey stood patiently, occasionally turning to watch Jack's movements with those remarkably intelligent eyes. "Can't keep thinking of you as the donkey, like you're some piece of equipment." The animal's ears flicked forward when Jack spoke, and something in that attentive gesture reminded him of a scripture story from his childhood. Gideon, the reluctant judge who had been chosen for an impossible task. It seemed fitting, somehow, for a creature that had survived when everyone expected it to perish. "Gideon," Jack said aloud, testing the name. The donkey's head turned toward him immediately, as if recognizing something true. "Well then, Gideon it is." They made camp that evening in a sheltered grove beside a small creek, the first running water they'd found since leaving Copper Falls. Jack went about his familiar routine, tending his mare, gathering firewood, setting up his simple canvas shelter, while Gideon explored the immediate area with careful, methodical thoroughness. The donkey seemed to understand the concepts of camp boundaries and safe grazing, never wandering far, but investigating every rock and bush with the attention of an experienced traveler. As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, Jack found himself telling Gideon stories. It wasn't something he'd done in years. Talking to animals had always seemed like the first sign of a man going soft in the head. But something about the donkey's attentive presence made conversation feel natural rather than foolish. "Spent most of my life moving," Jack said, stirring the beans he'd put on to cook. "Never saw much point in staying anywhere long enough to call it home. People die, places change, and the road keeps going whether you follow it or not." Gideon had positioned himself just inside the circle of firelight, close enough to be part of the camp, but far enough to bolt if danger appeared. It was the behavior of an animal that had learned caution through experience rather than instinct. "Your previous owners," Jack continued, studying the donkey's reaction. "What really happened to them?" At the mention of former masters, Gideon's ears flattened slightly, not with fear, but with something that looked remarkably like grief. The expression was so human that Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Over the next hour, as they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, Jack began to piece together what he could remember about Gideon's history. Pete Garrison had acquired the donkey from a prospector named Thompson, who died in a cave-in up near Silver Creek. Before Thompson, the animal had belonged to a trader named Morrison, who'd been found shot dead on the trail to Helena robbery, everyone assumed, though his goods and money had been left untouched. 3 deaths in 5 years. Jack could understand why the villagers had grown superstitious, but he'd seen enough of frontier life to know that death came easy in the territory. Cave-ins, freezing, robbery. These were the common hazards of mountain living, not supernatural punishment for keeping company with a particular animal. Still, as he watched Gideon in the firelight, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than simple coincidence. The donkey had finished the handful of grain Jack had offered, and now stood quietly at the edge of camp, head raised and ears alert. Something in his posture suggested he was listening to sounds beyond Jack's hearing, the careful attention of a creature that had learned to watch for danger. "What is it, old friend?" Jack asked softly. Gideon's head turned toward the trail they'd traveled, then back toward the deeper mountains. After a moment, the donkey relaxed, but the incident left Jack thoughtful. Either the animal possessed unusually acute senses, or it had learned to be watchful for reasons that had nothing to do with natural predators. That night, as Jack lay in his bedroll listening to the familiar sounds of the mountain wind through pine boughs, the distant call of an owl, the soft shuffling of Gideon moving around the camp, he found his mind turning to memories he usually kept buried. He'd had a home once, before the wandering years began. A small ranch in Colorado, a woman named Elizabeth who'd believed in building something permanent together, plans for children and a future that stretched beyond the next job or the next trail. But permanence, Jack had learned, was a luxury the frontier rarely offered. Disease had taken Elizabeth in the space of a week, leaving him with a ranch he couldn't bear to keep and a future that suddenly felt empty of purpose. That had been 15 years ago. 15 years of moving from place to place, working just long enough to earn supplies and traveling money, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments that could break his heart again. It had been a successful strategy. In its way, a man couldn't lose what he never allowed himself to have. But now, listening to Gideon's gentle breathing in the darkness, Jack wondered if his carefully constructed solitude had cost him more than he'd realized. The donkey's presence felt oddly comforting, not just company, but companionship. The difference was subtle but significant. Morning brought clear skies and a decision that surprised Jack with its certainty. Instead of following the main trail toward familiar winter camps, he found himself studying the mountain ridges to the east. There were old mining tracks up there, routes that led to abandoned claims and forgotten settlements. Most travelers avoided that country, too remote, too dangerous, and haunted by stories of failed ventures and disappointed hopes. But something about the way Gideon had positioned himself that morning, facing those eastern peaks with what looked like anticipation, made Jack reconsider his usual routes. "What do you think, partner?" he asked, adjusting the new halter one final time. "Feel like seeing some country that doesn't know our reputation." Gideon's response was to take several steps toward the eastern trail, then pause to look back at Jack with an expression that seemed to say, "Well, are you coming or not?" They broke camp and began climbing toward the high country, leaving behind the familiar paths Jack had traveled for years. With each mile, the air grew thinner and the silence deeper. But it wasn't the oppressive quiet of loneliness, it was the expectant hush of possibility, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath to see what two outcasts might discover in the forgotten places of the world. The frayed rope halter moved gently with Gideon's steady gait, a simple thing made from practical necessity, but somehow transformed into something more, a symbol of trust between two souls who had found each other at the moment when they needed companionship most. Behind them, Copper Falls continued its struggle against drought and desperation, convinced that banishing one supposedly cursed animal would somehow solve their problems. Ahead lay territory that few men had seen and fewer still had mapped, holding secrets that might change everything if Jack and Gideon were brave enough to discover them. The eastern trail proved more challenging than Jack had anticipated. What had looked like a simple ridge, crossing from below, revealed itself as a maze of switchbacks and hidden ravines, each turn offering new obstacles and surprising views. Gideon, however, seemed to navigate the difficult terrain with an ease that impressed even Jack's experienced eye. On their third day in the high country, a late-season storm caught them exposed on a narrow ledge with nowhere to shelter. The wind drove sleet horizontal across the mountainside, and Jack began to worry they'd made a fatal mistake leaving the familiar trails. But Gideon suddenly left the path, picking his way carefully across loose scree toward what appeared to be solid rock face. "That's not going anywhere, old friend," Jack called over the wind, but the donkey persisted. As they drew closer, Jack realized his error. What had looked like unbroken stone was actually a cleverly concealed opening, hidden behind a natural outcropping that made it nearly invisible from the trail. The cave beyond proved to be more than a simple shelter. Someone had worked this space deliberately, widening natural chambers and building crude furniture from local timber. Jack struck a light and explored, while Gideon stood patiently in the entrance, shaking the sleet from his coat. In the deepest chamber, Jack discovered evidence of recent habitation, not just the casual occupation of a passing traveler, but the careful preparation of someone planning a longer stay. Sleeping furs were neatly rolled and stored in a dry alcove. Provisions sat arranged on natural stone shelves. Most intriguingly, a collection of papers lay weighted down on a rough wooden table, covered with what looked like maps and detailed notes. Jack examined the documents by candlelight, his pulse quickening as their significance became clear. These weren't casual travel notes or simple territorial maps. Someone had spent considerable time surveying this region, marking potential mineral deposits and water sources with the kind of precision that suggested serious prospecting work. The handwriting was educated, the observations detailed and technical. Whoever had prepared these materials understood both geology and practical mining knowledge that represented years of experience and considerable investment in proper equipment and survey tools. But the most remarkable discovery lay beneath the maps, a comprehensive chart of the region showing not just topographical features, but claims markers, water rights, and what appeared to be a network of connected mining operations stretching across several mountain valleys. Jack spread the largest map on the table and studied it carefully. The work was professional quality, far beyond anything a casual prospector might produce. This represented a major operation, one that would have required significant capital and coordination between multiple parties. Yet the cave showed no signs of recent occupation. Dust covered everything except the areas where their entrance had disturbed the air. The sleeping firs, when Jack examined them closely, carried the musty scent of disuse. Whatever operation these maps represented, it had been abandoned for months, possibly longer. "What do you make of this, Gideon?" Jack asked, turning to find the donkey standing just inside the chamber, studying the maps with what appeared to be recognition. The donkey approached the table cautiously, then did something that made Jack's breath catch. Gideon touched his nose to a specific location on the main map, a valley marked with multiple claim symbols and detailed notations about ore quality and extraction potential. Jack followed the donkey's indication to a section labeled Blue Creek Valley, with annotations that made his experienced eye widen. The mineral assays recorded there suggested deposits rich enough to support major mining operations, the kind of wealth that could transform a struggling community like Copper Falls if properly developed. But someone had abandoned all of this, leaving behind months of careful work and valuable intelligence. The question was why. Jack gathered the most important maps and tucked them carefully into his saddlebags. Whatever story these documents told, it was connected to country they were already traveling toward. The storm outside had begun to weaken, but darkness was falling, and the cave offered better shelter than anything they'd find on the exposed trail. As he prepared a simple meal from his supplies, Jack found himself studying Gideon with new curiosity. The donkey's reaction to the maps suggested more than casual interest. Either the animal possessed remarkable intelligence, or it had been in this region before, possibly with previous owners who'd been involved in the abandoned mining operation. The cave felt warm and secure after the harsh exposure of the trail, but Jack slept fitfully that night. His dreams were filled with images of hidden wealth and abandoned claims, of men who'd disappeared, leaving their life's work behind in mountain caves. When he woke before dawn, he found Gideon standing alert near the cave entrance, ears forward and body tense with attention. Jack joined the donkey and peered out into the grey pre-dawn light. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystal clear and covered with a thin layer of fresh snow. But something in Gideon's posture suggested the animal had detected more than just weather changes. "What is it?" Jack whispered, straining his own senses for any sign of trouble. Then he heard it, the distant sound of shod hooves on stone, moving with the careful rhythm of someone trying to travel quietly. Someone was following their trail and making an effort to remain undetected. Jack quickly gathered their gear while Gideon continued his vigil at the cave mouth. The maps were safely tucked in his saddlebags, but their value would be meaningless if they couldn't stay ahead of whatever pursuit was tracking them through the mountains. As they prepared to leave the shelter that had served them so well, Jack took one last look around the abandoned cave. Someone had invested significant time and effort in establishing this base camp, only to abandon everything when success seemed within reach. The parallels to his own life, building something only to walk away when it mattered most, were uncomfortably clear. But this time would be different. This time, Jack was beginning to realize He had a partner whose loyalty had already been tested by far worse trials than mere inconvenience. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the high country, whatever secrets those maps might reveal, he and Gideon would face them together. The sound of approaching hooves grew closer as they slipped out of the cave and back onto the mountain trail, heading deeper into territory that might hold answers to questions Jack was only beginning to understand. Jack worked by firelight that evening, his weathered hands steady despite the complexity of the task before him. The brass compass from the abandoned cave had been beautiful once, finely crafted with detailed engravings around its rim, and a needle that had probably guided its owner through countless successful journeys. Now the crystal face was cracked, the needle stuck, and the internal mechanism clogged with moisture and debris from years of neglect. But Jack had learned long ago that broken things could often be made whole again, given patience and the right tools. His knife blade served as a screwdriver, carefully removing the tiny screws that held the compass together. Gideon watched the delicate process from his position near the fire, occasionally shifting his weight, but never moving far enough away to break the comfortable circle of their shared camp. "Your previous owners," Jack said conversationally as he cleaned corrosion from the compass's internal workings, "I'm starting to think they weren't just unlucky prospectors." The donkey's ears twitched at the mention of former masters, but his expression remained attentive rather than distressed. Over the past week, Jack had noticed that Gideon showed remarkable familiarity with the high country terrain, consistently choosing the safest paths and avoiding areas where less experienced animals might struggle. More tellingly, the donkey demonstrated knowledge of basic prospecting procedures, standing patiently while Jack examined rock formations, positioning himself downwind when they encountered potentially dangerous mine shafts, and showing particular interest in areas where water and mineral deposits intersected. "You've been up here before," Jack continued, using a thin wire to free the compass needle from its seized position. "Probably more than once, judging by how comfortable you are with all this." The compass mechanism clicked softly as Jack reassembled it, each piece fitting into place with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. When he held it up to test the needle's movement, Gideon moved closer to examine the instrument, his dark eyes following the magnetic needle as it swung toward north. Jack had always possessed steady hands and an intuitive understanding of mechanical things, skills that had served him well during his years of wandering. There was something deeply satisfying about taking a broken object and restoring it to usefulness, a kind of small victory against the entropy that seemed to govern so much of frontier life. "There we go," he said, closing the compass case and testing its function one final time. The needle pointed true north, steady and reliable despite its period of abandonment. Good as new, or near enough. But even as he celebrated the small triumph, Jack remained aware of the larger mystery surrounding their journey. The maps from the cave had revealed an extensive mining operation in the valleys ahead, complete with detailed surveys and mineral assessments that suggested considerable investment and expertise. Yet something had caused the entire enterprise to be abandoned, leaving behind valuable equipment and months of careful work. Their unknown pursuer had stayed with them for 3 days now, maintaining careful distance but never quite disappearing. Jack caught occasional glimpses of movement on distant ridges, always far enough away to avoid identification, but close enough to suggest persistent interest in their movements. Gideon had proven invaluable in detecting their followers' presence, often alerting Jack to sounds or movements that human senses missed entirely. The donkey's mountain experience was becoming more apparent daily, not just familiarity with terrain, but understanding of the subtle signs that indicated human activity in seemingly empty wilderness. On their 4th day above the tree line, Gideon led them to a hidden trail that Jack would never have discovered on his own. The path wound between massive boulders and along narrow ledges, following routes that seemed to defy the mountain's natural contours. It was engineered rather than natural, the work of men who'd needed regular access to remote locations. The trail brought them to the edge of Blue Creek Valley, the location Gideon had indicated on the cave map. Jack's breath caught as he surveyed the valley floor spread below them. Even from a distance, he could see evidence of extensive human activity, cleared areas that suggested mining operations, the geometric lines of constructed roads, and the dark mouths of tunnel entrances scattered across the valley walls. But like the cave, everything appeared abandoned. No smoke rose from what should have been active camps. No movement suggested ongoing work. The valley held the peculiar stillness of a place where significant effort had simply stopped. Jack consulted the repaired compass, then compared their position to the detailed maps from the cave. According to the surveys, they were looking at one of the richest mineral deposits in the territory, enough wealth to support a substantial operation for years. "So what happened?" he asked aloud, studying the empty valley through his field glasses. "Why would anyone walk away from this?" Gideon's response was to start down the steep trail toward the valley floor, picking his way carefully but confidently, as if following a route he'd traveled many times before. Jack followed, leading his mare and wondering what they would discover in the abandoned mining camps below. The first structures they encountered confirmed Jack's growing suspicions about the scale of the operation. These weren't the crude shelters of individual prospectors, but substantial buildings designed for extended occupation, bunkhouses, cook shacks, equipment storage, and administrative offices, built with the kind of permanence that suggested long-term investment. All of them stood empty, their doors secured but not locked, their interiors neat and organized, as if the inhabitants had simply stepped away for a brief absence rather than permanent abandonment. In the main office building, Jack discovered additional maps and documents that painted an even clearer picture of the operation's scope. Multiple companies had been involved, with coordination extending beyond simple mining claims to include transportation networks, supply contracts, and marketing agreements with Eastern buyers. This hadn't been a speculative venture, but a carefully planned enterprise, backed by serious capital and professional expertise. The kind of operation that should have produced steady wealth for everyone involved. Yet all of it had been abandoned within the past year, judging by the dates on the most recent documents Jack could find. As evening approached and they made camp near one of the empty bunkhouses, Jack found himself studying Gideon with new understanding. The donkey hadn't just been in this valley before he'd been part of the operation, working regularly with men who'd treated him as a valued member of their team rather than simple beast of burden. The compass in Jack's pocket pointed steadily north, its repaired mechanism faithful and true. But the real navigation they needed now wasn't geographical, it was moral and practical. Whatever had happened in Blue Creek Valley, whatever had caused prosperous men to abandon certain wealth, the answers were somewhere in this network of empty buildings and silent mine shafts. And based on Gideon's behavior, those answers might explain why 3 previous owners had died, and why a desperate village had been willing to condemn an innocent animal rather than face uncomfortable truths about their own choices and fears. The silver mining pick gleamed in the morning sunlight, its steel head pristine and sharp despite months of abandonment. Jack hefted the tool with appreciation. This was a craftsman's implement, balanced and well-made, the kind of equipment that cost serious money and lasted for decades of hard use. But what struck him most was the pick's condition. No rust marked the metal, no wear patterns suggested regular use. Someone had invested in the finest tools available, then left them behind without extracting a single load of ore. "This doesn't make sense, Gideon," Jack said, examining the tool more closely. The donkey stood nearby, watching Jack's investigation with what appeared to be approval. They'd been exploring the abandoned mining sites for 2 days now, and each discovery raised more questions than it answered. The main shaft entrance showed signs of recent excavation, fresh timber supports, newly cleared access routes, and equipment arranged with the systematic organization of an active operation. But everything stood frozen in time, as if the workers had simply vanished in the middle of a productive day. Jack descended into the mine shaft, lantern in hand, and rope secured to Gideon's saddle for safety. The tunnel extended deeper than he'd expected, professionally excavated with proper ventilation and support structures. This wasn't the hasty work of desperate prospectors, but the careful engineering of men who expected their operation to last for years. 30 feet down, the tunnel opened into a natural cavern that took Jack's breath away. The lantern light revealed veins of silver ore running through the rock walls like frozen lightning, more wealth than most men would see in a lifetime concentrated in a single chamber. But the cavern also revealed something else that made Jack's blood run cold. Scattered across the floor were the remnants of mining equipment, broken tools, torn canvas, and dark stains that looked ominously like dried blood. Jack examined the evidence carefully, his frontier experience helping him reconstruct what might have happened. This hadn't been an accident or a cave-in. The damage patterns suggested violence, deliberate destruction, rather than natural disaster. When he emerged from the shaft, Gideon was standing alert and tense, ears forward and body positioned as if ready to bolt. The donkey's behavior confirmed Jack's growing suspicions that they weren't alone in the valley. "Easy, partner," Jack said softly, checking his rifle before moving to a position with better visibility across the valley floor. "What do you see?" Gideon's attention focused on a ridge line to the south, where movement among the rocks suggested their persistent follower had finally decided to close the distance. Jack studied the area through his field glasses until he spotted a lone rider, making his way carefully down the slope toward their position. The man was older, probably in his 60s, riding a good horse and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to mountain travel. But what caught Jack's attention was the way Gideon reacted to the approaching figure, not with fear or hostility, but with what looked remarkably like recognition. Jack positioned himself with tactical advantage and waited, rifle ready but not obviously threatening. The rider approached slowly, hands visible and posture non-aggressive, until he was close enough for conversation. "Name's Thomas Whitmore," the man called out. "I've been following you folks for near a week now, hoping for a chance to talk." Jack studied the stranger carefully. Whitmore appeared to be exactly what he claimed, an aging prospector with intelligent eyes and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades working the mountains. But Jack had learned not to trust appearances in country where men died for reasons that had nothing to do with bad luck or natural hazards. "Talk about what?" Jack replied, keeping his rifle casually ready. Whitmore's eyes moved to Gideon, and his expression softened with what looked like genuine affection. "About that donkey you pulled from the river, about what really happened to his previous owners, and about why you're smart to be asking questions instead of believing the stories those folks down in Copper Falls have been telling." The older man dismounted slowly, showing his age but also demonstrating that he carried no immediate threat. Gideon moved closer to Jack, but didn't show the alarm he'd displayed around the villagers back in Copper Falls. "You know something about what happened here," Jack said. It wasn't a question. Whitmore nodded toward the abandoned mining equipment. "I know this whole operation was sabotaged. I know good men died trying to protect what they'd found. And I know that donkey of yours was the only witness to murder that got blamed on coincidence and superstition." The statement hung in the mountain air like a challenge, demanding response from men who'd learned to be cautious with their trust. Jack studied Whitmore's face for signs of deception, but found only the steady gaze of someone telling difficult truths. "You were part of this operation?" "Surveyor and assayer," Whitmore confirmed. "Worked for the consortium that put this together. Best job I ever had, working with decent men who paid fair wages and treated their animals right." His eyes moved to Gideon again. "That donkey carried more survey equipment up these mountains than any 3 horses could have managed. Smart as any human, and twice as reliable." Jack felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. What happened to the operation? Whitmore's expression darkened, Greed happened. Some folks down in Copper Falls got wind of what we'd found up here, started making claims about mineral rights and water access. When we wouldn't cut them in for shares they hadn't earned, they decided to take what they wanted by force. The older man moved closer to the mine entrance, his movements careful but purposeful. Pete Garrison was our camp foreman. Good man, honest as they come. When the trouble started, he took Gideon and tried to get word to the territorial authorities. Never made it past the first ridge. Jack remembered Pete's death found frozen in a snowdrift with a bottle of whiskey, blamed on drinking and poor judgment. They made it look like an accident. Easy enough to do in this country, Whitmore agreed grimly. Especially when the people investigating are the same ones who committed the murder. Mayor Henriksen's been running Copper Falls like his personal kingdom for years, and the idea of real wealth coming from outside his control didn't sit well with him. Gideon had moved closer during their conversation, positioning himself between the two men as if encouraging them to trust each other. The donkey's behavior suggested familiarity with Whitmore, but also a deeper understanding of the conversation's significance. "Morrison and Thompson?" Jack asked. "Same story, different methods," Whitmore said. "Morrison got too close to proving what really happened to Pete, so they staged a robbery. Thompson was asking too many questions in Helena about missing mining claims, so they arranged a cave-in that looked accidental. The implications were staggering. Jack had assumed he was dealing with frontier superstition and coincidental deaths. Instead, he'd stumbled into a conspiracy that reached from mountain mining camps to territorial government offices. "Why didn't you come forward before now?" Whitmore's laugh held no humor. "With what proof? 3 dead men and a donkey that was supposedly cursed? The people who could have testified were either dead or had disappeared into country where nobody could find them. I've been hiding in these mountains for 8 months, trying to stay alive long enough to find evidence that would stick in a territorial court." Jack thought about the maps and documents they'd discovered, the careful records of mineral wealth and operational planning. "The cave where we sheltered during the storm that was your base camp." "One of several," Whitmore confirmed. "I've been documenting everything, building a case that might actually convince authorities who aren't in Henriksen's pocket. But I needed proof of what happened to the actual miners, not just the survey work we'd completed." The silver pick in Jack's hands suddenly felt heavier, weighted with implications he was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just abandoned equipment, it was evidence of violence committed for the sake of wealth that could have benefited everyone if greed and fear hadn't intervened. "What do you need from us?" Jack asked. Whitmore's eyes brightened with hope he'd probably given up expecting. "Help me document what's left down in those mine shafts. Help me prove that this operation was destroyed by murder, not bad luck or supernatural curses. And help me make sure that Donkey's story gets told the right way, as a witness to injustice, not a bringer of misfortune." Jack looked at Gideon, who was watching both men with alert intelligence. The donkey had survived 3 murders, carried the truth through months of persecution, and somehow led them to the evidence that could expose everything. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening, painting the abandoned mining camp in golden light that made the wealth hidden in these mountains seem both beautiful and terrible. Somewhere down in Copper Falls, desperate people were struggling with drought and failing crops, blaming their troubles on superstition while the real causes of their suffering planned their next moves in comfort and safety. Jack hefted the pristine mining pick one more time, feeling its balance and imagining the work it could have accomplished in honest hands. Then he handed it to Whitmore with the weight of decision. "Show us what you need to prove," he said. "It's time this story got told properly." The wooden cross stood stark against the mountain sky, its simple craftsmanship speaking to the careful respect Jack had always shown for the dead. He'd carved it from a piece of sound pine, measuring and shaping each line with the precision of a man who understood that some gestures carried weight beyond their simplicity. "Samuel Morrison," Jack read from the inscription he'd burned into the crossbeam. died seeking truth. It wasn't much of an epitaph, but it was honest, which seemed more important than eloquent words that nobody would believe. They'd found Morrison's remains in a collapsed section of tunnel, buried under rocks that had been carefully arranged to simulate a natural cave-in. But Whitmore's experienced eye had identified the deception. Immediately the support timbers had been deliberately weakened, the collapse triggered at a specific point to ensure maximum lethality. He was getting close to something, Whitmore said, standing beside the grave they'd dug in a level spot overlooking the valley. Morrison had connections in Helena, people who could have brought territorial investigators up here to look at what we'd found. Jack tamped the earth firm around the cross's base, ensuring it would stand against mountain weather. Gideon watched the burial ceremony with what appeared to be solemn attention, occasionally moving closer to the gravesite, as if paying his own respects to a man he'd known. The past 3 days of exploration had revealed the full scope of the conspiracy Whitmore described. The Blue Creek Valley operation had been sabotaged systematically, with key equipment destroyed and critical personnel eliminated through methods designed to appear accidental, but the evidence was still there for men who knew how to read the signs. Water rights, Whitmore continued, consulting a notebook filled with careful observations. That's what this was really about. Morrison discovered that Mayor Henriksen had been filing false claims on water sources throughout this region, using shell companies and forged documents to establish legal control over resources that belonged to the territory. Jack had found the hidden spring Morrison died, protecting a source of pure mountain water that could supply mining operations, agricultural development, or municipal systems for decades. Control of that water meant control of everything else that depended on it, including the struggling communities down in the valleys. "So they killed him for filing papers?" Jack asked. "They killed him for threatening their monopoly," Whitmore corrected. Henriksen and his associates had been planning to control development in this entire region, deciding who could prosper and who would fail based on their own interests. Our consortium represented outside capital and territorial oversight, everything they couldn't manipulate or corrupt. The implications extended far beyond Blue Creek Valley. Jack was beginning to understand that the drought affecting Copper Falls might not be entirely natural. If water rights had been illegally diverted or controlled, then the community's suffering was at least partly artificial, created to maintain dependence on the very people who claimed to be trying to help. "The donkey," Jack said, watching Gideon explore the area around Morrison's grave. "Why blame him specifically?" Whitmore's expression softened with what looked like paternal pride. "Because that animal's too smart for his own good." Gideon witnessed Morrison's murder, and somehow Henriksen's people figured out that he could lead investigators back to evidence they'd tried to destroy. Easier to spread stories about curses than admit they were afraid of what a donkey might reveal. The afternoon was growing late, and Jack had promised to scout the upper valley before dark. But something about the burial site felt incomplete, as if Morrison's death required more acknowledgement than a simple wooden cross could provide. "Tell me about him," Jack said. "What kind of man was Morrison?" Whitmore sat on a nearby boulder, his face thoughtful in the slanting sunlight. "Trader by profession, but he understood geology better than most college-trained men I've known. Had a gift for reading country, seeing what was hidden beneath the surface. More than that, though, he was honest. In a business where men lie as easily as they breathe, Morrison's word meant something." Jack found himself thinking about Elizabeth, about the honest life they'd planned together before disease and circumstance destroyed their future. Morrison had been trying to build something legitimate in a region where corruption seemed to be the normal way of conducting business. "He had family?" Jack asked. "Sister in Denver. I wrote her after he disappeared, but never got an answer. Probably figured he'd just moved on to new prospects. The way traders do." Whitmore's voice carried regret for communications that had never been completed, for people who would never know what had really happened to someone they'd loved. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Jack made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. He pulled out his journal and wrote a careful description of Morrison's burial site, including detailed directions and landmark references that would allow someone to find the grave even years in the future. "What are you doing?" Whitmore asked. "Making sure he's not forgotten," Jack replied, continuing to write. "When this is all over, when the truth comes out, his sister will want to know where he's buried. She'll want to know that someone took the time to do things properly." Gideon moved closer, as Jack wrote, as if understanding the importance of the documentation. The donkey's presence had become a comfort over the past weeks, not just companionship, but a reminder that loyalty and intelligence could survive, even in circumstances designed to destroy them. The wooden cross cast a long shadow across the mountain grass, pointing toward the valley, where desperate people struggled with problems that weren't entirely of their own making. Morrison had died trying to expose the truth about resources that could have solved those problems. Now it fell to others to complete the work he'd started. Jack closed his journal and looked at the simple grave marker one more time. Tomorrow they would continue documenting evidence, building the case that might finally bring justice for Morrison and the other victims of Henrikson's conspiracy. But tonight, at least, a good man's sacrifice had been properly acknowledged by people who understood what he died trying to accomplish. "Rest easy, friend," Jack said quietly. "Your story's not over yet." As they walked back toward their camp, Gideon paused once more beside the gravesite, his dark eyes fixed on the wooden cross with what appeared to be understanding. Some bonds, Jack was learning, transcended the boundaries between species loyalty, memory, and the determination to see justice done, even when the cost seemed impossibly high. The blood-stained ledger lay open on the makeshift table they'd constructed from mining equipment, its pages revealing a conspiracy more extensive and calculated than Jack had imagined possible. The neat handwriting belonged to Morrison, but the story it told was written in the careful observations of a man who'd realized he was documenting his own death warrant. "Look at these entries," Whitmore said, his finger tracing columns of figures that painted a damning picture. Morrison tracked every suspicious death, every convenient accident, every piece of missing equipment. He knew exactly what was happening, and he was building evidence to prove it. Jack studied the ledger's contents by lantern light, his understanding of the situation shifting with each revelation. The drought affecting Copper Falls hadn't been entirely natural. Water rights had been systematically diverted through forged documents and intimidation, creating artificial scarcity that increased dependence on Mayor Henrikson's emergency resources. But the most shocking discovery lay in Morrison's final entries, written in the days before his murder. He'd uncovered evidence that the conspiracy extended beyond simple water rights manipulation. Henrikson and his associates had been running a territorial-wide operation, using their positions to control mining claims, manipulate territorial surveys, and eliminate anyone who threatened their monopoly on natural resources. "They weren't just stealing from our operation," Whitmore said grimly. "They were stealing from the entire territory and using murder to cover their tracks." The ledger contained names, dates, and detailed documentation of bribes paid to territorial officials. Forged documents filed with land offices and a systematic campaign of violence designed to eliminate witnesses and competitors. Morrison had compiled enough evidence to bring down not just Henrikson, but a network of corruption that reached into the territorial capital. More personally devastating was Morrison's discovery of why Gideon's owners had been targeted specifically. The donkey hadn't just been a witness to random crimes, he'd been deliberately used as bait to draw out people who might expose the conspiracy. They knew Morrison was getting close to the truth, Jack realized, reading between the lines of the careful entries. So they killed Pete Garrison and made sure Gideon would eventually end up with Morrison. When Morrison took the bait and started investigating Pete's death, they had him exactly where they wanted him. Whitmore nodded grimly. And when Morrison got too close to proving murder, they eliminated him and passed Gideon on to Thompson. Same pattern. Use the donkey as bait to identify threats, then eliminate the threats and move the evidence to the next target. The calculated cruelty was breathtaking. Henriksen's group had turned an intelligent, loyal animal into an unwitting instrument of murder, using Gideon's natural tendency to bond with kind owners as a way of identifying people who might cause problems for their operation. That's why they called him cursed, Jack said, understanding finally dawning. It wasn't superstition, it was cover story. Spread rumors about bad luck, and nobody looks too closely at the actual causes of death. But Morrison's final entries revealed something even more significant. In his last weeks, he'd discovered that the conspiracy was preparing to move beyond individual murders to large-scale elimination of entire communities that posed threats to their control. Copper Falls was scheduled for natural disaster, a dam failure that would be blamed on drought stress, but would actually result from deliberate sabotage. They're planning to kill the whole village, Whitmore said, his voice tight with horror. Wipe out everyone who might remember the original water rights, then move in with rescue operations that let them control the rebuilding. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with mountain air. The same people who'd tried to drown Gideon were planning mass murder, disguised as tragic accident, to protect their illegal control of territorial resources. The ledger's bloodstains took on new significance as Jack realized they marked the exact moment Morrison had understood he was going to die. The final entry, written in increasingly unsteady handwriting, was a desperate attempt to hide evidence where honest investigators might eventually find it. Hidden documents in cave system. Map coordinates 42.7N, 114.3W. Trust no territorial officials except Judge Patterson, Helena District. Gideon knows location of additional evidence. Animal understands more than people realize. If found dead, investigate Mayor Henriksen, Copper Falls. Water rights fraud extends to territorial level. Planned dam sabotage, scheduled before winter freeze. Save the village, save Gideon. S. Morrison. Jack read the final entry aloud, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of Morrison's last words. The man had used his dying moments to leave instructions for preventing mass murder, trusting that someone would eventually care enough to follow the trail he'd left. The cave coordinates, Whitmore said. That's the site where you found me camped. Morrison knew I'd go there eventually, knew I'd find his message and understand what it meant. Gideon had been standing quietly nearby during their examination of the ledger, but now he moved closer to the table, his dark eyes focused on the blood-stained pages with what appeared to be recognition. The donkey touched his nose gently to Morrison's final entry, confirming what Jack had begun to suspect. He understands, doesn't he? Jack said. Not just words, but meaning. He knows what Morrison was trying to tell us. More than that, Whitmore replied. He's been trying to lead someone back to this evidence for months. Every time they passed him to a new owner, he'd try to guide them toward the truth. But they all died before they could act on what he was showing them. The full scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but Morrison's documentation provided a clear path forward. They had evidence of murder, fraud, and planned mass destruction. More importantly, they had time to prevent the dam sabotage that would destroy Copper Falls. But they also had to acknowledge a harsh reality. They were 3 men and a donkey, facing a conspiracy backed by territorial officials and willing to commit any crime necessary to protect their interests. Jack closed the ledger carefully, treating Morrison's final testimony with the respect it deserved. The bloodstains on its pages represented more than evidence of murder. They marked the sacrifice of a man who'd chosen truth over safety, justice over survival. Morrison trusted us to finish what he started, Jack said, looking at Whitmore and then at Gideon. Question is, are we capable of keeping that trust? The mountain knight pressed close around their small circle of lantern light, holding secrets and dangers that seemed almost overwhelming. But within that circle sat proof that good men had died for important reasons, and that their deaths might still serve a purpose if the right people were willing to act on the truth they'd preserved. Gideon's steady presence reminded Jack that loyalty and intelligence could survive even the most calculated attempts to destroy them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the knowledge that they were fighting for something larger than their own survival. They were fighting for justice that had been too long delayed. The iron mining cart lay partially buried beneath years of accumulated debris, but its contents told a story that made Jack's hands shake with controlled anger. Bags of high-grade silver ore filled the cart's bed wealth that should have belonged to the territorial government and the investors who'd legitimately funded the mining operation. Instead, it represented stolen resources that Henriksen's people had been smuggling out systematically while spreading stories about cursed claims and failed operations. $20,000 worth, minimum, Whitmore estimated, examining the ore samples with his experienced eye. And this is just one cart. Morrison's notes suggest they'd been removing processed ore for months before they shut down the operation. Jack photographed the evidence methodically, using the camera equipment Whitmore had salvaged from the mining camp. Each image would serve as documentation for the territorial authorities, proof that the Blue Creek Valley operation had been profitable rather than cursed, productive rather than failed. But time was running short. Morrison's ledger indicated that the dam sabotage was scheduled for the week before winter freeze, less than 10 days away. The conspirators needed to destroy Copper Falls before the spring melt, when territorial inspectors would have access to investigate the drought's artificial causes. Gideon had led them to the hidden cart with the same uncanny accuracy he'd shown throughout their investigation. The donkey's behavior suggested not just familiarity with the mining operation, but detailed knowledge of where evidence had been concealed. More than once during their weeks together, Jack had caught himself wondering if animals understood more about human motivations than people generally credited. "We need to get word to Judge Patterson," Whitmore said, consulting Morrison's notes about trusted territorial officials. "If we can reach Helena with this evidence—" "There's no time," Jack interrupted. "Even if we left today, rode hard, and found Patterson immediately available, we couldn't organize official intervention before they destroy the dam. Those people down in Copper Falls will be dead before territorial justice catches up with this conspiracy." The mountain evening was clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant peaks seem close enough to touch. But Jack felt the weight of approaching winter in his bones, along with the pressure of decisions that would determine whether dozens of innocent people lived or died. "So, what do you propose?" Whitmore asked. Jack studied the maps spread across their makeshift table, tracing routes and calculating distances with the precision of a man whose survival had always depended on accurate planning. The dam above Copper Falls was accessible by several routes, but all of them required careful timing and considerable risk. "We stop them ourselves," Jack said finally. "Prevent the sabotage, expose the conspiracy, and make sure the evidence reaches honest authorities." It was a desperate plan, made more challenging by their limited resources and the enemy's advantages in numbers and territorial connections. But Jack had spent 15 years learning that sometimes desperate action was the only response to impossible circumstances. "You realize they'll kill us if they catch us," Whitmore pointed out. "They'll kill us anyway," Jack replied. "At least this way, we might save the village and make sure Morrison's death means something." Gideon moved closer as they discussed strategy, positioning himself where he could observe both men and the maps they were studying. The donkey's intelligent attention had become a constant during their investigation, as if he understood that human conversations about evidence and justice directly affected his own survival. Jack found himself remembering Elizabeth's death, the helpless feeling of watching disease destroy someone he loved while being unable to take any action that would matter. He'd spent 15 years running from that helplessness, choosing solitude over the risk of caring about outcomes he couldn't control. But Morrison's blood-stained ledger had changed something fundamental in Jack's thinking. The surveyor had died trying to protect people he barely knew, trusting that someone would eventually care enough to act on the evidence he'd preserved. That trust created obligations that transcended personal safety or comfort. "There's something else," Whitmore said, consulting Morrison's notes. "According to his final entries, Henriksen's people have been monitoring territorial communications. They'll know if we try to send word to Helena, and they'll have time to accelerate their timeline." The conspiracy's reach was more extensive than Jack had initially realized. They weren't just facing local corruption, but a network that could intercept official communications and manipulate territorial responses. Traditional law enforcement might be compromised before it could become effective. "Then we handle this ourselves," Jack repeated, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from having no acceptable alternatives. "We document everything, preserve the evidence, and make sure the truth survives, even if we don't." They spent the evening preparing for what might be their final mission. Jack cleaned his rifle with the methodical care of a man who understood that mechanical precision often determined survival outcomes. Whitmore organized the documentary evidence, creating multiple copies of the most critical materials and hiding them in locations where honest investigators might eventually discover them. Gideon watched their preparations with alert attention, occasionally moving closer to examine equipment or maps, as if assessing their readiness for the challenges ahead. The donkey's presence had become more than companionship. It was a reminder that loyalty and intelligence could survive even systematic attempts to destroy them. As the night deepened and they finalized their plans, Jack found himself thinking about the river stones still resting in his jacket pocket. He'd picked them up during Gideon's rescue, smooth fragments worn gentle by years of current and weather. Now they felt like tokens of a simpler time, when his biggest concern had been finding winter shelter rather than preventing mass murder. "You don't have to do this," Jack told Whitmore. "You've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. Morrison's evidence will eventually reach the right people, and justice will be served in its own time." Whitmore's response came without hesitation. "Those people down in Copper Falls don't have time for eventual justice. Besides, I made Morrison a promise before he died that his work wouldn't be wasted, that the truth would come out, regardless of what happened to the people trying to expose it." The commitment was absolute, the kind of decision that defined character more clearly than years of easier choices. Jack recognized something of his younger self in Whitmore's determination. The man he'd been before loss and disappointment had taught him to avoid attachments that could cause pain. But perhaps Morrison's example suggested a different approach to frontier life. Perhaps commitment to larger principles could provide meaning that transcended personal safety or comfort. Perhaps caring about outcomes beyond immediate survival was what separated living from merely existing. The iron mining cart sat in the lantern light, like physical proof that good work could be stolen, that honest effort could be corrupted, but that evidence of truth would eventually emerge for people willing to look for it. Morrison had died protecting that evidence, trusting that someone would care enough to act on what he'd discovered. Now it fell to Jack, Whitmore, and an intelligent donkey to honor that trust by preventing the final crime in Henriksen's conspiracy, the destruction of an entire community to protect illegal profits and territorial corruption. The mountain night pressed close around them, holding dangers and challenges that seemed almost overwhelming. But within their small circle of preparation and determination sat proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by justice rather than self-interest. Tomorrow they would ride toward Copper Falls, carrying evidence of conspiracy and the slim hope that 3 unlikely allies might be enough to prevent mass murder disguised as natural disaster. The tarnished sheriff's badge lay heavy in Jack's palm, its metal surface pitted with age and weather, but still bearing the clear inscription, Deputy Sheriff, Territorial District 7. They'd found it clutched in the skeletal fingers of a body hidden in one of the deeper mine shafts, another victim of Henriksen's conspiracy, another piece of evidence that the corruption extended far beyond simple mining fraud. Deputy Marshal William Hayes. Whitmore read from the identification papers they'd discovered with the remains. Morrison wrote about him, territorial lawman who came up here asking questions about the missing mining reports. Never made it back to Helena. Jack studied the badge with the grim understanding that they were looking at proof of how far Henriksen's people would go to protect their operation. Killing territorial law enforcement officers represented a level of criminal ambition that bordered on rebellion against federal authority. But it also represented opportunity. Hayes had been carrying official documents when he died, including territorial warrants that gave Jack and Whitmore legal authority to investigate federal crimes and make arrests in the name of territorial justice. "These warrants are still valid," Jack said, examining the legal papers carefully. "Hayes was investigating exactly the crimes we've been documenting. We can act with official authority." They'd returned to Copper Falls as the morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and red, riding openly rather than attempting concealment. The direct approach felt dangerous but necessary. They needed to present their evidence publicly before the entire community in a way that would make it impossible for Henriksen to suppress or discredit their findings. The village was buzzing with activity when they arrived, the kind of urgent movement that suggested crisis rather than normal morning routines. Jack soon discovered the cause. Mayor Henriksen had called an emergency town meeting to discuss immediate evacuation due to dangerous structural problems with the dam above the village. "Perfect timing," Whitmore said grimly. "They're accelerating the timeline. Probably saw us coming and decided to trigger the disaster ahead of schedule." The town meeting was already in progress when Jack, Whitmore, and Gideon approached the community center. Through the open windows, they could hear Henriksen's voice raised in urgent rhetoric about engineering assessments and imminent dam failure, about the need for immediate relocation to temporary camps that had been conveniently prepared in advance. Jack felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the manipulation being employed. Create artificial urgency, offer prepared solutions, and rush people into decisions before they had time to think clearly or ask difficult questions. It was a technique he'd seen used by confidence men and territorial carpetbaggers throughout his years of frontier travel. "Citizens of Copper Falls," Jack called out as they entered the meeting hall, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Before you make any decisions about evacuation, you need to hear evidence about what's really been happening in these mountains." The room fell silent as the villagers turned to stare at the three dusty travelers who'd interrupted their crisis meeting. Jack recognized many faces from his brief previous visit: Sarah Mitchell, the blacksmith's widow, Tom Bradley, who ran the general store, and dozens of other people who'd stood by silently while their neighbors tried to drown an innocent animal. Mayor Henriksen's face had gone pale at their unexpected appearance, but he recovered quickly, his politician's instincts providing smooth responses to unexpected challenges. "Folks, this is the stranger who interfered with our community decision about the cursed animal," Henriksen announced, his voice carrying dismissive authority. "I'm afraid we don't have time for outsider theories when we're facing immediate danger from dam failure." But Jack was already moving toward the front of the room, carrying the leather satchel that contained Morrison's ledger, Deputy Hayes's badge, and photographic evidence of the conspiracy they'd uncovered. Gideon followed close behind, his presence causing visible unease among the villagers who still believed in his supposed curse. "The dam isn't failing," Jack said clearly, his voice reaching every corner of the crowded room. "But it is scheduled for sabotage by the same people who've been stealing your water rights and murdering anyone who threatened to expose their operation." The accusation landed like a physical blow, creating a moment of shocked silence before voices erupted in confusion and denial. Some villagers shouted questions, others demanded explanations, and a few began moving toward the exits, as if unwilling to hear whatever revelations might follow. "That's a serious charge, stranger," Henriksen said, his voice steady but his eyes flickering toward the room's exits. "I hope you have evidence to support such wild claims." Jack opened the satchel and removed Deputy Hayes's badge, holding it high enough for everyone to see. "I have the badge and identification papers of Territorial Deputy Marshal William Hayes, murdered while investigating mining fraud in this region. I have documented evidence of conspiracy, water rights theft, and planned mass murder." The badge created immediate impact among the village's most frontier communities respected territorial law enforcement, and the sight of an official badge commanded attention even when carried by strangers. "Marshal Hayes disappeared months ago," someone called from the back of the room. "Search parties never found any trace of him." "Because his body was hidden in a mine shaft, along with evidence of the crimes he was investigating," Whitmore replied, stepping forward to support Jack's presentation. "The same mine shafts where 3 other murder victims were concealed after they threatened to expose systematic theft of territorial resources." Jack opened Morrison's blood-stained ledger and began reading selected entries, his voice steady and factual as he detailed the conspiracy that had been operating under their noses for years. Names, dates, documented bribes, forged water rights claims, and a systematic campaign of violence designed to eliminate witnesses and competitors. The room's atmosphere shifted as the evidence accumulated. Initial skepticism gave way to growing alarm as villagers recognized the implications of what they were hearing. These weren't wild theories from unstable outsiders. This was carefully documented evidence presented by men who clearly understood the legal and practical significance of their discoveries. The small brass bell chimed softly as Jack lifted it from the evidence satchel, its clear tone cutting through the confused voices of the crowd like a call to attention. The bell was simple but well made, the kind of practical decoration that working animals wore to help their handlers locate them in difficult terrain. "This bell belonged to Gideon," Jack said, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded meeting hall. "It was found among the personal possessions of Samuel Morrison, along with other items stolen after Morrison's murder. Physical proof that your cursed donkey was actually the victim of systematic persecution designed to cover up territorial-level crime." The sight of the bell created immediate reaction among the villagers. Several people who'd known Morrison during his time in the area began whispering among themselves, recognizing the evidence of connection between the murdered surveyor and the animal they'd condemned. Mayor Henriksen had recovered from his initial shock and was mounting a counterattack, his politician's instincts providing smooth responses to the accumulating evidence. "Folks, this is exactly the kind of hysteria we can't afford during a genuine emergency," Henriksen declared, his voice carrying practiced authority. "These strangers are presenting random objects and claiming they prove wild conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, engineering reports clearly indicate that our dam could fail at any moment." But Jack was ready for the deflection. He pulled out the photographs Whitmore had taken of the hidden ore carts, the blood-stained ledger, and Deputy Hayes's remains, spreading them across the meeting table where everyone could see the documented evidence. "Mayor Henriksen," Jack said formally, "by the authority vested in Deputy Marshal Hayes and transferred to me as his designated successor in this investigation, I place you under arrest for conspiracy, murder, theft of territorial resources, and planned destruction of community property." The formal arrest declaration created immediate chaos. Some villagers shouted support for their longtime mayor, others demanded to examine the evidence more closely, and several people began moving toward the doors, as if the meeting had become too dangerous for continued attendance. But before anyone could leave, Gideon moved to the center of the room and did something that silenced every voice in the hall. The donkey walked directly to Mayor Henriksen and began pawing at the floor in front of the mayor's feet, his behavior unmistakably deliberate and meaningful. "What's he doing?" Sarah Mitchell asked, her voice hushed with growing understanding. Jack consulted Morrison's notes, then looked up at the crowd with grim certainty. According to Morrison's observations, Gideon consistently demonstrates recognition behavior around people involved in his owner's deaths. The animal's memory for faces and scents is apparently exceptional. The implication hit the room like a physical blow. Gideon wasn't just identifying Henriksen as a person of interest, he was identifying him as someone directly connected to the murders that had been blamed on coincidence and supernatural curses. Henriksen's composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulating evidence and the donkey's unmistakable accusation. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "You can't seriously expect people to believe that an animal's behavior constitutes legal evidence." "No," Jack agreed, "but I can expect them to believe territorial documents, photographic evidence, and documented testimony from murder victims who took the time to record what they discovered before they died." He opened Morrison's ledger to the final pages, where the surveyor had written detailed descriptions of conversations he'd overheard, meetings he'd witnessed, and specific threats made by identifiable people. The entries painted a damning picture of conspiracy that reached beyond Copper Falls, to include territorial officials and Eastern business interests. Morrison documented everything, Whitmore added, moving to stand beside Jack in a show of unified testimony, including recorded conversations where Mayor Henriksen discussed eliminating witnesses and staging the dam failure to cover up their water rights theft. The evidence was overwhelming, but Jack knew that proving guilt and preventing immediate disaster were two different challenges. Even if the villagers accepted the truth about Henriksen's conspiracy, they still faced the practical problem of stopping sabotage that might already be in progress. "Tom Bradley," Jack called to the store owner, "you know these mountains better than most. How long would it take armed men to reach the dam from here?" Bradley consulted his pocket watch, his face grave with understanding. "Hour and a half, maybe 2 hours if they're carrying equipment. But if they left when they saw you folks coming into town, they could already be there," Jack finished. The timing was dangerously close, with success or failure potentially decided by margins measured in minutes rather than hours. The room erupted in urgent discussion as villagers grappled with the reality that their community faced immediate destruction from people they'd trusted with their safety and governance. Some demanded immediate evacuation, others called for armed resistance, and a few suggested sending riders to alert territorial authorities. But Jack knew that conventional responses wouldn't be sufficient. The conspiracy had been planning this operation for months, with contingencies for territorial intervention and community resistance. Only unexpected action by people Henriksen couldn't predict or control might be effective. "I need volunteers," Jack announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Men who know the mountain trails and aren't afraid to confront armed saboteurs. We stop this now, or Copper Falls gets washed away in what looks like a natural disaster." The response was immediate and heartening. Tom Bradley stepped forward first, followed by 6 other men who understood that their community's survival depended on action rather than discussion. They weren't professional fighters, but they were mountain men who knew the terrain and understood the stakes. Gideon's brass bell chimed softly as the donkey moved closer to Jack, positioning himself as if expecting to join the mission to the dam. The animal's presence had become essential to their investigation. His intelligence, memory, and knowledge of the terrain had guided them to evidence that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. "What about him?" Bradley asked, nodding toward Mayor Henriksen, who stood surrounded by increasingly hostile villagers. "Sarah Mitchell," Jack called to the blacksmith's widow, "I'm deputizing you as temporary sheriff with authority to hold prisoners pending territorial investigation. Keep Henriksen and anyone else who tries to leave town until this is resolved." The formal delegation of authority felt right, transforming what might have been vigilante justice into legitimate law enforcement action. Morrison's documentation and Deputy Hayes's badge provided legal foundation for extraordinary measures in extraordinary circumstances. As the volunteers gathered their weapons and prepared for immediate departure, Jack felt the weight of leadership settling across his shoulders like a familiar burden. He'd spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, but Morrison's sacrifice and Gideon's loyalty had made withdrawal impossible. The brass bell chimed once more as Gideon took his position among the volunteers, ready to guide them toward the final confrontation with the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. Whatever happened at the dam, Jack realized, would determine not just Copper Falls' survival, but whether justice could triumph over corruption in territory where law and order often depended on the courage of ordinary people willing to risk everything for larger principles. The new leather harness gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its craftsmanship representing the finest work Copper Falls leather artisans could produce. Hand-tooled designs decorated the straps, and brass fittings caught the light like small stars against the rich brown hide. But more than its beauty, the harness represented something far more significant, the community's recognition of Gideon's transformation from outcast to hero. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the dam, where Jack and the volunteers had arrived just in time to prevent the explosive charges Henriksen's men had positioned against the main support structures. The fight had been brief but decisive, with territorial law enforcement arriving 2 days later to take custody of the saboteurs and begin the complex legal proceedings that would eventually see justice served. Jack stood in the doorway of his new home, a modest cabin on the edge of Copper Falls that the grateful community had insisted on building for him, watching Gideon graze in the meadow beyond the village. The donkey wore his beautiful new harness with what appeared to be quiet pride, though Jack suspected the animal was more pleased with the community's changed attitude than with the fine leather goods. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The same people who'd tried to drown Gideon as a cursed burden now treated him as the town's most valuable citizen. Children brought him apples and sugar cubes, women included him in their afternoon conversations, and the men who'd once feared his presence now consulted him about weather patterns and trail conditions with complete seriousness. He really does understand more than we gave him credit for. Sarah Mitchell had said just that morning, after Gideon had led a lost child back to town from the surrounding forest. It's like he reads intentions better than most people. Jack had come to believe that assessment was entirely accurate. Over the months of their partnership, he'd watched Gideon demonstrate intelligence that bordered on the uncanny, not just in practical matters like navigation and weather prediction, but in understanding human emotions and motivations with remarkable precision. The mining operations had resumed under proper territorial oversight, with profits being distributed fairly among investors, workers, and the local community. The artificial water shortage had ended once Henriksen's illegal diversions were eliminated, and Copper Falls was experiencing the kind of prosperity its residents had only dreamed of during the drought years. But the most significant changes were less tangible, involving trust and community cohesion that had been restored through shared crisis and common purpose. People who'd been suspicious of outsiders now welcomed travelers with genuine hospitality. Neighbors who'd been competitive over scarce resources now collaborated on community projects that benefited everyone. Jack found himself thinking often about Morrison's sacrifice and the blood-stained ledger that had preserved evidence of conspiracy. The surveyor's trust in future justice had been vindicated, but more than that, his example had inspired others to choose principle over safety when circumstances demanded courage. The territorial investigation had revealed the full scope of Henriksen's network, leading to arrests and prosecutions that reached into the territorial capital and several eastern cities. Water rights throughout the region had been restored to their rightful owners. Mining claims had been validated through honest surveys, and new territorial policies had been implemented to prevent similar corruption in the future. Whitmore had accepted appointment as territorial mining inspector, a position that allowed him to travel throughout the region, ensuring that honest operations were protected and illegal activities were quickly identified. He visited Copper Falls regularly, always making time to check on Gideon's welfare and share news from his investigations. That donkey saved more than just one village, Whitmore had observed during his most recent visit. His story has become known throughout the territory. Other communities are questioning their own local officials, demanding transparency in resource management, and insisting on territorial oversight for major decisions. Jack walked out to the meadow where Gideon was grazing, carrying the handful of sugar cubes that had become part of their daily ritual. The donkey looked up at his approach, ears forward and eyes bright with the intelligence that had first caught Jack's attention months ago by the river. "Well, old friend," Jack said, offering the treats and adjusting the beautiful harness that symbolized Gideon's new status in the community. Hard to believe how much has changed since that morning by the river. Gideon accepted the sugar cubes with gentle lips, then leaned against Jack's shoulder in the gesture of trust and affection that had become their private communication. The simple contact carried weight beyond its physical nature, acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between two outcasts who'd found purpose in each other's company. Jack pulled the smooth river stones from his pocket, the same stones he'd picked up during Gideon's rescue. They'd become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of the moment when choosing compassion over convenience had changed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. The village below them bustled with the activity of a thriving community, children playing safely in streets where adequate water flow had restored gardens and livestock, adults working on construction projects that expanded rather than merely maintained their homes, and the general atmosphere of optimism that came from facing challenges successfully rather than being defeated by them. "You know what I've learned?" Jack asked, speaking to Gideon but really addressing the larger questions that had occupied his thoughts since choosing to stay in Copper Falls. 15 years I spent running from attachments, convinced that caring about people or places would only lead to pain when they were lost. Gideon's attention remained focused on Jack's voice, the donkey's expression suggesting understanding that transcended species barriers. "But Morrison was right," Jack continued. "Some things are worth the risk. Some bonds are strong enough to survive whatever tries to break them. And sometimes the very act of caring, really caring about something larger than yourself, is what makes life worth living." The late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, the same colors Jack had admired during his years of solitary wandering. But now the beauty felt shared rather than observed in isolation, connected to a community and purpose that gave meaning to each day's simple pleasures. As they walked back toward the village together, Jack reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A moment of compassion by a river had led to friendship, investigation, justice, and ultimately the salvation of an entire community. Morrison's sacrifice had been vindicated. Deputy Hayes's murder had been solved, and territorial corruption had been exposed through the determination of ordinary people who'd chosen to act when action was needed. But perhaps most importantly, an aging drifter and a supposedly cursed donkey had discovered that redemption was always possible for those willing to risk everything for the sake of simple decency and mutual loyalty. The new leather harness caught the last rays of sunlight as they approached the village, its beauty representing not just craftsmanship, but transformation, the kind of change that came from recognizing value where others saw only burden, finding purpose where others found only problems, and choosing hope where others chose fear. In Copper Falls, at least, the story had ended well, and for Jack Rourke and Gideon, that was enough to justify all the risks they'd taken and all the challenges they'd faced together.